We have already, on a number of occasions, attempted to study the relationship of mind to consciousness. We hope in the present series to clarify this relationship a little more and to develop certain aspects of the subject which will have immediate and practical usefulness to us in daily living. As we probably all realize, in the course of the last century especially, the concept of mind has come to include the concept of consciousness. We regard these as almost identical terms. And while in certain departments of philosophy there may be recognized differences, in practical daily experience, we take it for granted that whatever we think about, we experience as consciousness. We think of consciousness as that which gives us the power to think. And when we turn our attention, our mental attention, upon any subject, we assume that we are examining it in terms of our consciousness. What is the essential difference, then, in the meaning of the two thoughts or terms? In idealistic philosophy, and certainly in classical thinking, consciousness implies participation as internal or experience analysis or value of an idea or circumstance. Thus, consciousness should enable us to say of something under consideration, "This I know." Nothing prevents us from saying this when we do not know. But I want to call to mind the fact that correctly the term "I know" should very seldom be applied. It must, such a term must be limited either to something entirely trite and of comparatively slight meaning, or else it must be reserved for something so profound, so deep an experience of consciousness that very few persons can legitimately claim to possess it. To say "I know" means that we possess the fullness of the fact or the truth of a thing. To know it means to totally comprehend it. To know it means to know its motivations, its most secret thoughts and processes. To know it is to know its cause, its true substance, its origin, its procedure, its method, and its destiny. To know it is to be completely and fully aware of every aspect of it. Not only its outward and visible parts, but its inward and invisible parts. Under such conditions, the term "I know" would be very rarely applied. On the other hand, we can say, "This I think," "This I believe." And thinking is a kind of defense of believing. We think about things, but we do not think with them. By the use of the mind, we can become aware of such qualities and attributes of things as may be known by the senses. And to the sensory evidence, we add a believing, which is a distillation or an extension by mental process to an apperception of certain values beyond those most immediately apparent. Therefore, if we see with our sensory perception a man stepping off the corner of a street and walking toward the other side of the street, we then close our eyes so that we do not see him reach the other side of the street. We will still, however, by the extension of our sensory evidence, assume that he reaches the other side of the street, and continue to visualize inwardly his advance toward what was obviously and evidently his original goal or purpose. Thus, by the mind, we not only see the visible parts of things, but we apprehend their probabilities. Thus, we gain the skill to estimate with certain prophetic skill the ordinary expectancies with which we are surrounded and with which various activities are associated. We may therefore say that by the mind we may perceive the structures of things, their actions and conducts. And we may also reason or rationalize upon the meanings of things which are visible, thus developing a morality, an ethics, or even a philosophy. These being the extensions of things obvious, and their motions and certain probabilities derived therefrom. All through this process, however, we realize that thought is dependent upon sensory testimony. It is very difficult for an individual to think about anything of which he has heard nothing, seen nothing, nor which he has contacted in any way. Thus it is difficult, if not impossible, for a person born blind to estimate the significance of color differences, or a person born deaf to estimate correctly tonal intervals. If, however, man has once possessed such faculty, but has lost them, memory, a mental power, comes to his assistance, and he may revisualize or revitalize such memories as are necessary to assist him to interpret incidents when some faculties have been disabled and can no longer testify. Substantially, however, the mind is built upon observation and upon reflections about things observed. These reflections, particularly, because they become more or less abstract, and because we are rather proud, in fact, a little awed by our own reflective ability, these reflections may be mistaken for consciousness. It may be assumed that when we enter a reflective or meditative state, we escape from the normal processes of mind into some extrasensory dimension of knowing. However, this is not strictly the case. For what we usually call reflection is merely one of the numerous faculties available to us in the general structure of mental phenomena. As we are not yet able to adequately define the boundaries of mental activity, as we are not able to determine correctly what part of life is entirely mental and what part is without mind, if such a part exists, we are unable to clearly differentiate between the various sensory reflexes, nor can we be sure whether our mental activity is arising from thoughtfulness, or from prejudice, or from opinion, or from a variety of secondary sources. We are told that man may say, "I think, therefore I am." Another man will say, "I am, therefore I think." And thought and human existence, the human state, have been regarded as closely associated. Yet whether thinking is a true evidence of humanity is still a moot question. For thinking has been indulged in since the beginning of history. Yet man has thought himself into more difficulties than he has ever thought his way out of. And when we become hopelessly involved in a situation from which no escape seems probable, we may almost certainly assume that we thought our way into it and arrived in a labyrinth in which finally our confusion was no longer dissolvable by any reasonable method. Then let us try to figure out how we shall determine the quality of mental activity. Each person can make a simple test for himself. You can sit down very quietly and say to yourself, "I will now try to have an original thought." And after a little time of really great industry, we may come up with something that sort of impresses us that way. We can perhaps arrive at some adage or some phrase, some neatly turned statement that, so far as we know, is not copied from anyone else. It probably is, because the Chinese observed long ago that there was nothing new under the sun, and that things haven't changed much since then. We may, however, convince ourselves that we have been able to do something original. If we really feel this, then we should more carefully analyze. Have we really had an original thought? Or have we rationally extended a previous pattern of thinking? Usually this is the case. Thus, in the Patent Office in Washington, there are thousands of patents which state themselves to be new and useful improvements upon something, for one patent that claims to be an original idea. In fact, it becomes a very difficult problem even in the Patent Office to determine originality. And it is usually considered sufficient, so I am told, to say that originality relating to a patent is the presentation of an application not already covered by a patent. It is assumed that it is original if someone else has not already patented it. This, of course, is an obvious error. For most ideas arise from the extension of thinking from something already familiar toward a new or improved application of that principle. Psychologically, there are two sources of ideas which can arise in the mind and may seem to have an originality in them. One of these sources is nature itself, nature entirely separate from human achievement. For all human achievement has arisen as the result of man's reflection upon nature. The second source is man's own nature, particularly his body and its structure. For hundreds and thousands of devices which we now consider indispensable and for which we give great credit to early discoverers are merely adaptations of functions and processes of the human body, adapted to some external usage. And we have discovered that there is a kind of analogy moving through nature. And because it was necessary for man, as a metropolitan being, to have a certain circulation and a certain great function of excretion, the study of this in man and its application to social structure resulted in the development of the great sewers and aqueducts of Rome. They were based directly upon the processes of the human body. Perhaps those who actually invented these devices or advanced them did not know this consciously, but because they had lived constantly in the presence of a universal ingenuity, in the presence of procedures, processes, and methodologies in the earth and in the sky and in nature around him, man finally adapted and adopted these things, finding uses for them in the development of his own way of life. Experimentations with musical composition have revealed again and again that unconsciously nearly every great composer has appropriated fragments from the melodies of other composers. He does not even know this, but he instinctively draws forth these fragments, and his contribution is not newness, but a new arrangement, or the bringing together of parts previously not united. In other words, another way of saying, new and useful improvements, or the extension of some available idea further into application or specialization. From all this, we have to realize that mentation is a kind of exercise or activity upon a level. Mentation may expand to the corners of the world or extend into innumerable fields, but it is bound by a certain level of altitude. It cannot ascend beyond a certain point. And if it descends too far below this certain point, it also loses effectiveness. The mind, therefore, is an instrument adapted to the objectivity of human experience. Mind has as its primary purpose the victory by man over environment and the integration of his resources toward orientation in the objective world. The mind, to accomplish this, must have overtones. And of these overtones, perhaps some of the most significant are philosophy, religion, and science. And here we will come to considerable discussion, particularly in religion and philosophy. As yet, science has not come to this division, but it must ultimately do so, and we already begin to see indications of this division within the body of science. Ages ago, thousands of years ago, religion divided into a formal worship and a mystical worship. Dividing, therefore, the intellectual concept of religion from its spiritual or consciousness level. Philosophy did the same thing. Philosophy divided itself into an intellectual system of philosophy and a mystical or abstract system. Intellectual philosophy being represented by such works as those of Kant and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and Hume and Lessing, whereas the mystical aspects of philosophy are to be found in such Oriental systems as Vedanta and Yoga, and in the Western systems of Bamy, St. Martin, and Baron Emanuel Swedenborg. These represent divisions within a structure. Science must ultimately come to the same division, and there must be a separation within the structure of science to distinguish a materialistic or physical science and a spiritual or mystical science, using the same essential instruments, but one dealing with an invisible or superphysical sphere of causes, whereas the other is limited largely to a visible physical sphere of effects. This is because the inner life of man ultimately divides between an intellectual and a mystical approach to the substance of knowing. Nearly all intellectualists are ultimately disillusioned. They plead the same sad story as Omar the tent maker, who engaged in great argument of this and that, but always came out by the same door wherein he went. The intellectual comes ultimately to the realization that the mind can go only a certain distance. From this, the individual tries to spread his wings by speculation and press the mind beyond the reason or beyond the fact towards the hoped-for truth. In a little time, however, this speculative instinct passes out of sober control, for as landmarks are lost, similarities and familiarities are left behind. The mind gradually ceases to have a functioning power of its own. Deprived of all cooperation from the sensory and reflective parts of itself, the mind ultimately goes to sleep. It has no possibility of escaping into consciousness or departing from the world of phenomena to which it belongs, by which it was generated, and concerning which it is completely absorbed and dedicated. Buddha points this out very clearly, for he makes the mind to be a production of sensory reflex. That it is not the mind that makes man see the world, but it is the world which makes man have a mind to see with. And all of our sensory reflexes are totally dependent upon objectivity for their own existence. If there was nothing to see, the faculties of sight would fail. If there was nothing to hear, the faculties of hearing would fail. But there is a very interesting thing, a problem that has long been debated. The old story is, would there be any noise if there was no one to hear it? We may say definitely that if man did not hear sound, he would dwell in silence. Therefore, silence arises either from the end of outward sound or the termination of inward hearing. Either can produce the same result. According to the Buddhist concept, therefore, the ear and the thing heard are in indispensable relationships with each other. And hearing or sound is the product of their union. And if either be removed, the product is destroyed. If this is true of the entire mental nature, then mental phenomena generates the mind, which in turn reflects upon mental phenomena. Remove the mind, and the mental phenomena ceases. Remove the mental phenomena, and the mind ceases. They are utterly interrelated and interdependent, one upon the other. The mystic, assuming this, has also assumed that it is quite easy for man in his search to overestimate the mind, and by failing to understand the instrument, to lose the skill to measure, weigh, and analyze the importance of its activities. We can never know how important thinking is unless we understand the process of thinking. We can never know whether we should follow our thoughts or not until we know how they are engendered, why they are generated, and the processes by which they are perpetuated and communicated. Thus, to accept the mind on faith is to accept the unknown. To accept our own thinking on faith may be foolhardy. And if we are badly trained, to accept our own thinking may be a catastrophe from which we will not even recover. To achieve, then, a certain attitude of wisdom, we must realize early in our search for realities that our own thoughts are not important, that nothing is true because we think it is true, nor is anything untrue because we do not think it is true. Believing is not knowing. Hoping is not knowing. And every procedure which arises in the process of mentation is no more valuable than the instrument that produced it, and no more significant than the level of action with which it is concerned. Man believing totally and completely in the importance of a material way of life will find thinking more valuable to maintain his concepts than a person who had a different concept of living itself. We live objectively in a world where thought and scheme and plot and plan are vital to our success. But they are vital only to our success in this dimension. They are vital only to the advancement of ends, which may or may not have any importance whatsoever in themselves. Usually they do not. But they are important because our own mind has told us that they are. And it is a brave man indeed who questions the profound thinking of himself. If, therefore, we wish to practically examine our own problem, we must realize that we have lived always upon surfaces. This does not mean that we are content to do so. I saw some articles recently, a study of brain structure, which pointed out that man at the present time uses less than 20% of his potential brain surface for processes of mentation. Also, it is noted that most of the thinking of man is now done on the surface areas of the brain. Whereas it has been also pointed out that there is much reason to believe that it is possible to stimulate the thought processes in the depth areas of the brain. This may mean an interesting analogy. Man's surface thinking with the surface of his brain. The hope that sometime his thinking will deepen as he uses the depth parts of his own thinking equipment. In any event, we do think on surfaces. And whenever we become involved with a problem that requires grave thoughtfulness or decision or value, we're usually in trouble. We do, however, have an advantage which in some ways compensates for numerous liabilities. I've heard this advantage advanced on many occasions. An individual did a very bad job of thinking, but instead of being ashamed of it, he said, well, there's one thing, the other fellow didn't do any better. Now, one of the things that saves us at the moment is that others are not doing it much better. It is not how well we are doing things, but that in the competitive procedure of living, our friends and associates and even our enemies are just about as inept at thinking as we are. Therefore, if we have one stray thought just a little better than theirs, we are on the way to victory. There is the old Spanish proverb, in the world of the blind, a one-eyed man is king. And in a world of those who think but little, even those who think badly have some advantages. Altogether, what saves us is our common stupidity. If the world, as Emerson points out, really let loose even a thinker, everything would be at hazard. However, presuming that the world did let loose the thinker, what would the answer be? All he could really do would be to organize the objective structures of things. He might produce a highly perfected and highly skilled blueprint for human conduct. But with all of this, he would probably be in the same position that man has always been in. Namely, he would require an army and a police force to enforce his own improvements. Because working with others who also think, he will find that every thought causes a reaction of antagonism from others. And as long as thinking is always on a level, and this level is objective, we are not going to have the integrities necessary to cause any problem to come to a proper and permanent solution. We're simply caught in the immaturity of our own perspective. Somewhere in this pattern of things, the so-called mental level of the normal person of today is in the interval between childhood and adolescence. The motion picture industry has said that the average member of an audience is 12 years old mentally. I can't say that the film industry has done anything to help these youngsters to grow up. But at the same time, thinking, even within the mental range, is still a comparatively neglected exercise. And we use the mind that we do have mostly to find excuses for the gratification of our prejudices and attitudes. Buddha points out that we usually exercise the intellect to defend the validity of our own mistakes. In other words, once having done something wrong, it becomes a matter of face-saving. We cannot admit that we are wrong. And we find it, therefore, easier to try to force ourselves to convince either our own lives or the lives of others that we are right, and to develop ingenious methods for supporting mistakes, or perpetuating them, or making new mistakes to bolster them up. And so finally, somewhere along the line, the whole flimsy structure falls to pieces together. If then we begin to analyze our thinking, even superficially, we realize that the mind has certain uses. That within the sphere of these uses, it is most vital, most important, and most helpful. But when expected to produce that which is not natural to it, or introduced to problems which are not reasonable for it, the mind produces conclusions or findings which are deceptive and irrelevant. And the mind, for instance, is very useful in memorizing telephone numbers, which are quite important to us. It also enables us to keep our appointments with reasonable punctuality if we can keep our minds on it. It also enables us to add up the multiplication table, to remember the things we learn in school. The mind also, perhaps, assists us to develop a strategy to protect our economic survival, or to anticipate the hazards which may come to us in business. The mind may encourage us to providence, encourage us to certain frugality. It will also open to us another kind of memory, the memory of our race, and that is tradition. It will enable us to profit from the mistakes of the past, if we so desire. It will enable us to remember or memorize efficient methods which have come down to us as skills in trades or professions. Also, the mind will enable us, perhaps, through a series of symptoms, to diagnose an ailment with some degree of success. Although from the same group of symptoms, 20 doctors may come to 20 conclusions, all different. These conclusions, therefore, indicate that the doctor, with the same symptoms to consider, is an equation in his own diagnosis. And because of the specializations of his own mind, or the attitudes to which he is addicted, he colors even his ability to interpret a series of simple landmarks. Everywhere, therefore, we do observe that the mind colors, and that in almost every procedure we find the mind, to a measure, over-anxious to please us, desirous of coming to that conclusion which we expect or demand, attempting to prove what we want to prove, and to disprove what we do not want to prove. If we wish to regard a person as unpleasant, the mind will assist us in every way to ferret out every undesirable characteristic of that individual. If, on the other hand, we have a natural affinity to that person, the mind will then set to work resolutely and obscure every defect in them. It is as though the mind was a kind of yes man, always arriving at the conclusion we demand of it. And to the degree that we do demand, the mind will be dishonest in our favor. And as this is what we wanted in the first place, we consider the mind admirable in every way and practically infallible, simply because it arrives at the conclusion that we desire. It also has another wonderful ability to forget. And when the conclusion proves to be wrong, the mind is able to escape all blame by transferring the injury to someone else or to some other time and some other place, and the individual just proven wrong will immediately start out on a new course of infallibles, never pausing to make any correction in the instrument resulting in the mistake. Thus the mind has an advantage that very few other persons or other qualities of life enjoy. The mind is the only instrument that we have which passes judgment on itself, therefore can always be found in an admirable state. We have no way of examining the mind except by the mind. So when we say to the mind, "Are you all right?" the mind will certainly say yes. Or if we say to the mind, "I do not like what you are doing," the mind will say, "Neither do I." It will always please us, it will always gratify us, and it will always lead us into further trouble. This in contradistinction to the general idea that we have that the mind is a noble leader of our living, that it has something resembling the qualities of a Cato or a Cicero, that it is fair and honorable, a mighty judge among judges, and that it sits aloof from all things, judging righteous judgment. Nothing could be further from the case. The mind is in every mess we get into. It is a Mephisto, ever ready to gratify our every desire. And then when trouble does come, the mind looks perfectly blank and said, "I have nothing to do with it." If the mind, then, is not behind all this conspiracy, what is? Behind the mind, undoubtedly, in the case of man, is what we call blind pressure. This blind pressure is simply emotional tension. It is intensity. Man says without thought, "This I like, this I do not like." Whenever he sees anything, he says, "This I want," if it is in any possible way useful to him. If he sees anything utterly objectionable, he says, "This I do not want." And having, by the intensity of attitude, determined a course of procedure, he then turns the detail of the procedure over to the mind, the duty of which is to prove that he is right, to advance every purpose as he wishes it to be advanced, and to block every situation which he desires to have blocked. The mind, therefore, is actually the servant of the emotional intensity of the individual. The mind does not control emotion. The mind is the victim of emotional intensity. The emotions are much older than thought. The emotions rise in instinct and impulse, and these control and direct life. So that what we call living is largely mentally sustained impulse or mentally sustained intensity. And by means of the mind, we try to find various ways of accomplishing our emotional purposes. Our emotional purposes of love or hate, of possession and loss, of joy and sorrow. We give, therefore, to the mind the job of causing or making available to us joy. We give to the mind the labor of taking from us sorrow. Therefore, we must rationalize ourselves into joy and out of sorrow, even if we have to create a new universe to sustain our position. Actually, when it's all said and done, it is very hard to determine and to decide how best mind can be directed to its natural end. One point, of course, we learn again simply from observation and from the study of life around us. Individuals have a tendency to be more honorable when they are not under pressure. They have a tendency to be more honest when the advantages of dishonesty are fewer. They have a tendency to be more kind when unkindness is less profitable. Also, we observe, as Mohammed pointed out, that most individuals are probably born honest and are gradually educated out of it by their friends and relatives. Consequently, the greatest good that we can do for the mind is to release it from slavery to the ulterior impulses of our own emotions. If we can actually say to the mind, you are a learned counselor, I want your opinion, and I am not going to give you the slightest hint of how I want the episode to be interpreted. I'm not going to tell you what I want or how I want it. But this is the catch. All this conversation is itself arranged by the mind. Therefore, we have got to find a way of preventing the mind from knowing that secret by which the mind will be contaminated. We can say to ourselves, I want the mind to tell me honestly what kind of a person Joe is. Of course, I think he's a skunk. But I'm not going to let this influence my mind. The thing is done already. The moment he internally admits or assumes any attitude, the mind is already conditioned. And it is rare indeed to find a person who can come to a completely impersonal or impartial judgment on any subject that has any bearing upon his own affairs. This is why Justice back in Egypt was blindfolded, and the goddess Maya, who carried the scales of the balance, was represented without eyes. It was to indicate that appearances must have no effect upon judgment, and also that we can only be just when we judge those things which have no profit in them for ourselves, and more than that, deal with subjects about which we have no preconception of any kind, and try to find an individual that meets that requirement. It is impossible, practically, to find a person today without preconceptions on almost every subject, even though he may not personally be involved. He is victimized by the press, by propaganda, by news, by all kinds of conditioning factors. And he is highly conditioned by the opinions of the learned, the informed, or experts, whom he regards, therefore, as suitable sources of information and upon whose opinions he builds. These people may be entirely wrong, but they become part of his basic mentation. Out of all of this, it becomes more and more evident as we proceed, and we could proceed much further, that the mind is a very mixed blessing, and that those who serve its impulses consistently are very mixed themselves, if not blessed. To recover from this, there has to be some solution, some way of breaking through this mental barrier. For out of the processes of the mind, operating under the pressure of the emotions and forming a closed corporation, not only does the individual come to false conclusions or inadequate conclusions, but he is blocked from any escape. He is locked ever more tightly within the mind, and he loses by degrees all perspective beyond the mental life itself. And as he cannot normally experience any internal state entirely separate from mind, he does not know what direction to turn in order to escape from this mental maze or labyrinth ruled over by his own ego, which is the part of him which must always be sustained and defended, and the intensities of which are the basis of nearly all of the psychic pressures from which he suffers. Out of this, East and West, ancient and medieval, developed a great pattern of monasticism. Monasticism, which in itself probably is no real solution to the problem, seemed to be the best opportunity. If you wanted to escape from the dishonesty of attitudes, place yourself in a position or condition in which the profits from dishonesty were diminished. In other words, if you renounced the world, if you gave up your worldly goods, if you gave up your name, taking some religious name meaningless to anyone else, and retired from the world and lived in a cave in the side of a hill, owning nothing, desiring nothing, possessing nothing, and dedicated perhaps only to the absolutely unselfish service of persons in need, with no thought of reward. Perhaps in this way, you could lower the pressure of desires. You could separate yourself from so many of the inducements to false thinking. You would find it perhaps easier to be impersonal, to be kind, to be fair, to be impartial, especially if you added to this procedure a religious conviction, positing the love of God and the love of your brother man, and attempting in every way you could to remove from your life even the shreds and rudiments of prejudice. Under such conditions, you might be relieved from the tyranny of this mental situation. Many tried it, and there have always been a few persons who were by nature monastic, who were able to retire quietly from the world and serve useful destinies without the pressures of the personal problems which afflict most. On the other hand, this same escape toward monasticism produced a frightful harvest of neurotics, individuals whose intensities rose through frustration, and who tried very hard to be better than they were, and as a result destroyed their sanities and made possible some of the most mutilating episodes in the religious history of mankind. So here again, there was no proof of a way out. But there was a principle involved, namely that honesty of thinking is in some way related to honesty of motives. That the individual who really and honestly wanted to be honest and had this desire basic within himself, had certain advantages and could depend upon his mind to serve him more effectively than it would serve persons with lesser standards of integrity. Consequently, antiquity emphasized the importance of idealism, of gradually elevating through thought things which were most important to highest position and estate, placing the contemplative life above the aggressive life, placing the life of wisdom above the life of barter, and also admitting that as man must earn his bread with the sweat of his brow, that it might be possible for him to maintain his economic status through reasonable indulgence in economic endeavor, and at the same time have another life, a life to which he could escape at the end of the day, a life of beauty and of value, in which principles would have an opportunity to be strong against the pressures of prejudice. The division, therefore, of the life of man into an ideal inner life was regarded as useful, inasmuch as it prevented the complete obscuration of ideals. It gave the person interior anchorage against the storms and tumults of the outer life. The entire concept, of course, was based finally upon the idea that when the sound and the fury passed, that the individual was able gradually, through the unfolding of his own abilities and his own standard of values, to relax away from inordinate pressures. He could gradually come to the state in which he would allow his mind to be honest. And each person can do this to some degree. I rather like some of the ideas of Buddha on this point also. He called attention to his disciples that it was not assumed that the average householder, the average student of the inner life, was to depart totally from all thought, leave the world behind and become an ascetic. This was not intended. This was only for those who had some strange karmic destiny that pressed them on to this, and also only for those for whom the way opened, so that this could be accomplished without evil to others, neglect to responsibilities, or by setting an example detrimental to the character of others. Buddha did point out, however, that if the individual would make one small correction in any area where he now has a fault, this one small correction will so greatly change his life that he will see the true and complete proof of the importance of growth, and he will be inspired naturally to such correction as is possible to him. The improvement of living comes not from merely contemplating perfection, but from the immediate achievement of some one small particular good thing, which in itself causes a general release of life from limitation or restriction. Assuming then that the mind can be given an opportunity to function, that it is not miseducated, that it is not perverted or corrupted by its own owner, that it is not given license to misrepresent itself, that a certain reasonable check is given by which the mind is itself disciplined to judge itself. We may have, as the Platonic philosophers pointed out, the way of educating the mind so that it gradually escapes from the pressure of desires and becomes a disciplined instrument of itself, capable of leading and protecting the body from such excesses of conduct as might be detrimental thereto. For man, then, from his very name, which in the ancient Hindu language, from manas, means the thinker, man is capable of educating the mind as he would bring up a child.